ACME would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands and waterways of Greater Melbourne, the people of the Kulin Nation, and recognise that ACME is located on the lands of the Wurundjeri people. We also acknowledge First Nations people as the original storytellers of this land, and recognise their significant contribution to the contemporary moving image.
So today, yes, we're focused on early years media literacy, and it's really exciting. I'm just going to give a very brief introduction before I hand over to Amanda and Tammy to do the bulk of the presentation. Today, we're going to focus on defining media literacy and why we think it's useful and why we think it's helpful in the early years. We're going to talk about a framework for approaching media literacy. There'll be a bit of a focus on the digital and screen time. So this question, when you start to focus on younger children and digital technologies, then screen time is one of those concerns. So we'll address that briefly. So why media literacy for young children? Before focusing on kind of policy guidelines and curriculum. And then quite a bit of the time today will be focused on some examples of practice that Tammy will share from some of the work that she's been doing. So to define media literacy then, if we just jump to that next slide. So media literacy, just in a very broad sense, is the ability to apply critical thinking while using and creating different kinds of media. That's according to the Australian Media Literacy Alliance. And so then the question becomes, well, what does it mean to apply critical thinking? And how might we apply critical thinking through play-based pedagogies in the early years? And so the approach that we take and that we're promoting today is to think about how we can ask these critical questions through this framework. And the framework has these 6 areas that can be used to ask questions. And although we're doing play-based pedagogy in the early years, it is possible to start asking these questions and to develop activities or opportunities that start to put forward these kinds of questions. And that's a lot of what the session will focus on today. So with technologies, how are media technologies used to access, create and circulate media? With representations, how do the media portray people, places and ideas? For audiences, who is the media made for and how do they respond to that media? Institutions, which organisations produce, distribute, regulate and educate about media? And then with languages, how do media create meaning through combining images, sound and text? And then finally, relationships. What relationships do we have with the media and how are our relationships mediated? And so we can use these 6 areas to begin to start to think about how we can organise curriculum and opportunities for students to learn. So I'm going to now hand over to Amanda to talk about that in a bit more detail.
Thanks, Michael. So one of the ways that we might think about what does media literacy look like when we're in early years classrooms or in the before school setting is we might think about the different types of media forms, the different types of technology, and also the different types of learning experiences that we might like children to engage with. So in terms of media forms, we might think about forms that we as adults potentially engage with as well in some ways, but we might think about how we might use them with young children. So things like photographs, videos, sound, podcasts, for instance. We might think about ebooks. So using an ebook, for instance, as a portfolio to collate a whole range of other types of media forms as well. We might also think about more specific device apps on devices or online that potentially have been built for young children, although some might not. So for instance, we might still use things like Google Maps to explore different areas, but obviously that's, a more adult sort of centric app or program in the first place. We might also think about the different types of technology that we might use here. And when we talk about technology, we might talk about real technology that we use, so cameras, for video, cameras for still images. We might think about different types of mobile devices and tablets and computers and that kind of technology. We also might think about different types of less real technology. So we might have, for instance, it's not uncommon to have a home corner with a broken keyboard that has been placed in the home corner, or wooden toys that resemble technology as well. So you might have the real technology, but you might also have the pretend play versions of technology too, which might be a useful inroad into thinking about that. Other types of technology we might draw on as well here are drawing and craft type materials. So they're not technology in a digital sense, but they're certainly tools that we might be able to draw on to help us think about our media literacy experiences. In terms of the actual learning experiences, there's a whole, in terms of play-based pedagogy, there's a whole range of things that you can draw on. When we're thinking about media literacy learning experiences with young children, we really want to consider things that are hands-on. So hands-on activities that children can actually be tactile with in some ways. We might engage with different types of art making and craft as well to inform some of the work that we're doing. We might construct and build different types of media. So we might, for instance, take a photo or take a series of photos and put them into potentially a short film or a photo story or something like that. We want to encourage children to experiment and play. So we don't need to be worried so much about building really polished forms of media. The media that we build, especially with young children, might be it might seem a little bit disjointed to adults, but it's still a really valuable learning experience for them to take the photos or to shoot video that potentially is a little bit wonky and might not always make sense the first time. Because as they develop and they experiment and practice with that, they will certainly learn how to use the equipment and tell their stories in more effective ways. And we can also think about how children might be different types of audience members as well. So, although no one's going to advocate for children sitting down and watching things for really long periods of time, there still might be benefits to children potentially watching snippets and having that discussion amongst themselves as children, but also led by an adult in the space as well there. So there are a couple of questions that might sometimes get raised either by you or potentially the people around you if you're starting to do this kind of media literacy work and thinking about what that might look like. So is media literacy digital? And the answer is sometimes. And there are plenty of ways to think about media literacy that don't use screens or don't use digital technology. So for instance, we might draw parts of stories and we might add a caption. We might pretend to have a frame or a pretend camera, and we might think about what happens when we take photos or how far away we need to be from objects to take photos, for instance. We could have photos, for instance, that are printed out. So as educators, we might print out a series of photos and rearrange them. And you can see that they're all instances where we might be thinking about media literacy concepts and thinking about storytelling, but we're not actually using digital technology. So technology isn't required. But I would suggest that offering some kinds of digital experiences when you're thinking about media literacy in the early years that are undertaken with a key concept in mind. So earlier, Michael spoke about the key concepts, and Tammy, as she presents some examples later this afternoon, is going to relate the examples to the key concepts. And so I think that doing this and using digital technology in this way will help to will help children to continue to think critically about the media and make some of those connections about digital technology. So actually using digital technology and learning some skills around how to do this safely, how to do this ethically, and how to do this for a purpose are still important aspects of media literacy. So does media literacy then mean increased screen time? And this might be a question, and there are really so many different answers to this. We know the term screen time is a little problematic because it doesn't account for the rich and varied activities that children undertake when they're using digital media. So if you do media literacy work and you use some form of technology, you might find you are using screens. So technically you might be using something digital a little bit more often than usual. But here we would really want to think about the purpose of the learning experience and what children are doing as they use the technology. and use that as a guide rather than a pure blanket ban on anything digital or anything deemed screens. So you might encourage more play and exploration rather than watching media, and that would be a really valid decision. You might encourage group work rather than individual work, for instance, to develop collaborative skills and to foster language development. So this idea that everything digital or anything screen time shouldn't happen in the early years is something that we do want to push back on a little bit. And the reasons for that, if I just jump to the next slide, is that the media is really connected to children's lived experiences. So things like, I'm sure that if you work in an early years classroom or an early years setting, you will see children playing with the stories from popular culture, for instance, like acting out different episodes of Bluey or whatever other TV show. And children are accessing different types of media across various aspects of their lives. So this is just a snapshot of some really quite recent research findings from the Digital Child, a nationally representative study looking at young children and what kinds of technology they firstly use. So you can see there that what technologies are present in children's homes. There's a whole range of technologies, television, mobile phones, and computers being some of the highest forms there or types of technology. We can also see that children use devices with a caregiver, and so a lot of them use technology with other people. But we can also see that children are using devices of different types on their own as well. And that's certainly not all children, or even the majority of the children, and majority of children of this study with most of the technology, but certainly they're starting to use different types of technology on their own. So it's really important that we prepare them to be able to think critically, not just about their use of technology and devices, but the media that is included on them, so that they have the skills and the dispositions to be able to understand what is happening, understand, that advertisements might be encouraging them to buy something, understand that potentially entering information might not into this particular app or form might not be the best idea, depending on what they're doing. So we also know that media literacy is developed over time. And while some of this happens as we just learn and grow and experience new things, adults play a really important part in helping children to take what they know and to be able to apply this in different types of, to be able to apply this across different media types of experiences. So for instance, a really kind of easy example, a child might be able to take a photo on a phone at home with their parent, or without their parent even, but they might need a little bit more support on how to use that and how to take a photo using a particular tablet device in an early learning setting. It might be slightly different camera settings, it might be a slightly different device, might use a different operating system, for instance. So they need help to be able to transfer those skills across different media forms and technology. Or maybe a child is a really great storyteller, and we've all had those children in our lives that can tell fantastic stories and are really rich with language, but actually translating that into some kind of media form, they might require some support with that. So selecting the right photos or recording a voiceover to match those photos, for instance. So it's really about helping children to be able to transfer that knowledge in different ways and to reflect as they're doing that. So an explicit focus on media literacy might help us as educators and teachers pay attention to how we support children as they develop this awareness of the media. And I would also argue that media literacy pedagogy is really aligned with early years pedagogies and play-based pedagogies as well. So thinking about media production, children engaging in hands-on experiences through creation and through play. Now, really briefly, because we definitely want to get to the examples, when we're thinking about what kind of policy guidelines and curriculum media literacy might align with, in terms of the EYLF version 2 here, if that's something that you're using, there's a whole bunch of places where media literacy education can certainly kind of touch on some of the different outcomes from the EYLF. And I've just popped a few up here as an example. So children learn to interact in relation to others with care, empathy, and respect. This is evident when children, for example, use and collaborate with others when using digital technologies. And then outcome, I won't read all of it, But outcome 4, so when children express and respond to ideas and feelings using a range of creative media, including photography and digital technologies, investigating ideas, representing their thinking using digital technologies there for outcome 5. So it certainly got a more significant focus in version 2 of the EYLF than it did in version 1. And it really gives you an opportunity to think about how we might be able to include these in our learning experiences. And then briefly, if you are, sorry, my mouse is just taking a moment. If you are a school-based educator or teacher, in terms of the policy guidelines and curriculum, I know many of the teachers here today might be Victorian teachers, but in terms of the Australian curriculum, certainly media literacy is apparent through the media arts and English curriculum separately. And then also ACARA has released a new media consumers and creators cross-curriculum priority that shows how media literacy education kind of threads through media arts, English and digital technologies as well. So that's another place to look to if you're thinking about media literacy and you're thinking about how to make sure that that's really linked to your curriculum, to your classroom practice and the curriculum. So now I'm just going to hand over to Tammy, who's going to present you some fantastic examples about what this looks like in practice.
Thanks, Amanda. Okay, so I have been for the last year doing some school-based work with prep and kindergarten teachers, so both looking at the early years at ACARA and doing some work in those classrooms with teachers, helping them learn how to do media literacy in practice in the classroom. So I'm going to share 2 of those examples with you today. The first one is I'm going to talk about one that we did in a kindergarten setting. Now I'm in the Queensland context, so by kindergarten we're talking about that final pre-compulsory year of schooling when they're 4 to 5, and we're drawing on the early years learning framework. So the first activity, it was a culminating activity for a body of work that I've been working on with this teacher, and I'll call it the My Monster Chatterpix activity. And these 4 images I've got on the screen at the moment are just to illustrate some of the things that we had previously done, to give you some context of some of the prior learning. Because I find, and the work that we've done has really found that with children, it's small bits, a little bit at a time, embedded throughout everything else that they're doing. So these are definitely things that we're building upon layer by layer. So the first thing is that they had one prior experience with the Chatterpix, which is this app that we use, similar to a lot of these kind of apps where the children could, with an iPad, take a photo, then they could add sound, and they could put on some little pictures or digital stickers that were part of the app, and then they could add some text if they wanted to on the screen as well, and output that as a video. So that essentially was what Chatterpix was, and they had a prior experience with it, so that we weren't adding complexity to this final activity. Second thing was that the teacher had, separate to the work I was doing with her, she had been doing an emotions unit with her students, and she had a set of resources they were using, and part of that was they had these characters that represented the different emotions. Many of you are probably familiar with these kind of resources, and because each of those characters was a different color, red for anger and yellow for happy and things like that, knowing that we were thinking about media literacy, and particularly with media languages, the teacher really lent into that, and she would talk a lot about how they could represent these emotions through colour in artwork, and this was something she commented on multiple times as part of the work they were doing with emotions. So that was in the air. The children were familiar with that idea. She then extended that a little with music. So we had a set of 5 songs, I think, that each represented different emotions that we had picked. So I think we had Darth Vader's theme from Star Wars for anger, and we had a sad Beethoven sonata for sadness, and things like that. So they had done the dancing activity and had talked about how you can talk about your emotions through words, but you can also express that through music or through physicality. And then the final thing, and this is sort of what we were really focusing on, was learning about creators and audiences. Now, as children get older and in sort of senior primary and high school, there'll be a lot of talk about, who created this media, what are the algorithms or the economic structures behind it, what are the biases, etc., etc. So when we're thinking about young children, where do we start? Just helping them understand that media was made by somebody. So somebody created this episode of Paw Patrol, or a group of people did, or who wrote this song, who sang this song that we're listening to, things like that. And then starting to be familiar with this idea of a creator and an audience. Now, the way that we'd largely introduced this was that the teacher had just used that terminology a lot over a couple of weeks period. So from anything from, as they were, painting, she would start to say, I love what you've created there. You're a great painting creator. Like, you've created this picture. And she'd say things like, who is this for? Oh, is this for your mum? Oh, she's going to be your audience. She's going to enjoy this picture that you have created. So she was doing that through many situations, I think, through including building block towers or sand pits, sand castles in the sandpit and stuff. She would talk about, you're the creators of this sandcastle, and as an audience, I'm really enjoying what you've done here. So that just really sets the scene for this activity that I will talk about next. So they were going to create a Chatterpix, a little short video each that featured their monster. And the teacher, there's a photo right here, is a bit of a messy pile of some of these monsters that they had created that they were featuring in the Chatterpix. So the teacher would start with each child by asking the question, who is your audience? Who are you going to make this for? And then how would you like them to feel as they watch your movie? So most of the children would pick a parent or a sibling, and then they would, I think the most popular emotions were scared, angry, or happy. Kind of what the children would say, this is what I want my audience to feel as they watch my movie. And so then it was a matter of, and we did this over a day or two, they created the monsters one day and made the Chatterpix the next day, whereas they built a monster, and they were really drawing on what their understanding of colour and other things to create their monsters. And then the context for this was, there was a 2-hour morning period in the morning where children could go inside or outside. There were multiple activities. The other educators were at different stations inside and outside, and the children kind of roam wherever they wanted to. We did this largely because we wanted this to be a one-on-one activity with the teacher and the student. So the teacher would sit there, and as they wanted to, the child would wander over, often one at a time, or 2 or 3, I think didn't really have more than 4, would kind of gather at a time around this table. And the teacher and the student would work together. The student would work the iPad, they pressed all the buttons and did everything they needed to, but the teacher was there to support them and talk them through it. Some of them were quite fast, having done it once before, others still required a lot of structure. But the process really was that the child would take the photo of their monster, they'd position it, they'd take the photo, then they would pick some music, and we used those same 5 pieces. The teacher would say, oh, I know, this is for your mum and you want her to feel scared, so let's listen to some music and you pick. And inevitably, if it was the scary one, the child would tend to pick the Disney Halloween soundtrack we had with the spooky noises and the creaking doors, or I think we had Pharrell's Happy, if it was happy, and things like that. So the children they pretty much picked what we would have thought they would pick for that emotions. They were making those connections, took their photo, then they came up with a character voice, and the teacher would talk with them, what is your monster going to say, and what kind of voice will they have? So you would have the really kind of angry monsters or the scary monsters, as they voiced this and came up with a very simple little line or 2 of their monster and what they would say. They had on some stickers, and then an important process right near the end was that they would watch it and review it. And often the children would take another photo, or they'd change slightly what their character was saying or how they were talking. It really was a chance for them kind of to critically reflect on their own work. And they were quite definite about things with all of the prep work that had been done leading up to do this. And then, when they were happy, the video was exported, and that was the end of that particular of that activity. So the things that worked well for this. One was repetition, the embedding of these skills and concepts over a period of time. Another one was the one-on-one between the teacher and child working together. Another one was that co-engagement and co-viewing. And we talk a lot, Amanda mentioned it too, that idea of co-engagement and co-viewing between adults and children, and it's really crucial, but also that co-viewing and co-engagement between children is really important too. So those children that were gathered around the side, you could really see if they had giggles from the audience on the side, you'd see the child really kind of lean into that and realize it was working as they continued with what they were doing. Or sometimes you'd see a child who's a bit more timid about the process. You'd notice they were modeling what they'd seen the child before do to some extent. So there was a lot of that engagement happening, and it really was lovely to see just the pride and the joy that the children would take. They really had been very intentional about what they were doing, and they were really talking a lot about, my mum will really like this, or I think my dad will really feel scared, or my sister or whatever is going to be she's going to feel angry when she sees my angry monster. So there was a lot of intentionality to it, which I think meant that media literacy learning was really in practice there. I think the next slide, yes, I won't spend long here, but along the top there I've got the 4 media key concepts that we were drawing on for this activity. So obviously languages and audiences, also representations and technologies. And you can maybe come back to this slide later after the presentation if you would like to, but here you can see I've just pulled out a few things from the early years learning framework, and you see they're across each of the 5 outcomes actually that you really could link to an activity like this. Okay, and then I'll give you, now I just want to talk briefly about another activity we did with a prep class. So again, Queensland context, which means that it's our foundation year of schooling here. So we're using in Queensland the ACARA, and these are 5 and 6 year olds. So with this particular class, we had been working on a unit with the teacher of reading the pictures. So we were, this idea that we can really learn a lot from pictures and we can communicate through that. So it's not just words in books and in movies that we're listening to. We had done a prior activity where they had listened, we had watched this short animation on YouTube. It's a simple little 2 or 3 minute video, Little Brown Bear Has a Temperature, but it was in French. And so that whole unit was how do we know what's happening, and they had to figure out using all the visual clues and the sound effect and audio clues, and there were a few activities around that where the children had to kind of figure out what was happening before we then watched the English version. They could see how well they had been able to read the pictures. So this activity was about flipping that on its head, and they were now creating, go to the next slide, Amanda, they were creating a picture that could communicate an idea to an audience. They were also, we were using those same concepts of audience and creators as well. So the teacher demonstrated this first. She had an iPad and she said, I need to take a picture that communicates the idea our classroom is colourful. And as the children all kind of sat on the mat, she walked around the room and she vocalised what she was doing. She talked about, was this? And she kind of held up the iPad. Oh no, oh, that's not very colourful. That's pretty colourful. That might work. As she kind of evaluated her choices and ended up over at this trolley here with the cups of pencils. And she took the first photo, the photo on the left with the iPad, and she held the iPad quite close. And she said, I might try a close-up photo. She took this photo of the yellow cup, and then she said, maybe a wide shot would be better. And she physically held the iPad up higher and took the photo that way. And both of these photos went straight to she sent them to the TV in the classroom or the big screen, which the children were enamored with. And they could look at these 2 photos and discuss as a class which one they thought worked better. And they decided together that the one on the right, the wide shot, showed the most colours and was the best way to discuss that our classroom is colourful. So that then led on to the children having their own turn. Now, this is a potentially fraud activity. It was the first time they had ever used iPads in this class. Their normal process, this was in term 2, and their normal process was to wait till term 3 or 4 to introduce iPads. And they had a system of work that they normally did. But we thought, well, we'll give it a go with this activity. So the children were in groups of 3, and there was 1 iPad per group of 3. And we picked these 3 sentences you see. We have lots of fun in prep. We learn lots of interesting things in prep, and we're hungry and we wish it was lunchtime. And each child so there were 3 children in each group, and each child had 1 of those sentences. So before we picked up the iPads, we really wanted them to be intentional about it and not just get carried away with the iPad itself. So we gave them each a cardboard frame, and they walked around the classroom and they had to design and plan what they were going to take their photo of, and as their little group. And they really were modelling themselves, most of them, on what the teacher had done. You could hear the conversations. They were trying different things and being quite thoughtful about it. And once they knew what they thought they were going to do, they had to walk over to the teacher and tell her, this is my plan. This is what I think I'm going to do. And she pushed them a bit. Sometimes she said, that's great. Other times she said, well, I'm not sure about that. And have you tried this? Or do you think a close-up or a wide shot? Go and have another look and decide. When they'd been sufficiently thoughtful about it, then she said, okay, you can go get the iPad. And we were on standby ready to really help them with how to do this. But we found that in the group of 3, we knew there were definitely some children in that classroom who didn't use technology very much at home. But we found that within the group of 3, there was someone in each group that did know enough to kind of find the camera icon and then press the red button to take the photo. So they actually required very little support from us to do this. And they walked around in their group of 3 and they each took their photo. And again, interestingly, because they had been so intentional and done their planning, they pretty much went straight to where they had planned to take their photo, took it, and then gave it to the next child. So it was more straightforward than we had anticipated it being. No guarantees in your own class, I suppose. In this particular class, it flew quite easily. And then we all went back to the mat and took a few minutes. This is probably the bit where it lagged the most. We had about 3 or 4 minutes where teacher aide, the teacher and I got those iPads and sent all of the photos to the TV to a folder so that they could all view them. And then they looked at the photos as a class, not knowing who had done which one, and they read the photos to try and figure out, which photo went with which phrase. And for the most part, they got it right. And that was really fun for each child to then say, yes, that was my photo, and yes, that was my sentence. So what worked well with this particular activity, the teacher demonstration was really key. The way that she really spent about 5 minutes picking her photo and lining things up and trying different things. And she really demonstrated that process. And it was interesting to see the children follow that process that she had laid out for them, particularly in making those decisions. The co-engagement and the learning with the peers. It was because of a limited number of iPads that we had put them in groups of 3. But actually, it worked really well having just, groups of 3 with one iPad, because there was so much learning and watching between each other. For the couple of kids who weren't very confident, another child was there to help them and say, yeah, no, that's how you do it. And yes, try it again. There's your photo. You've got it there. So, they're young children. They were really capable of doing this activity with each other. The creative planning time really, again, meant that it was very intentional, and I think made the actual photo taking quite streamlined. Of course, it worked well that in this class you could send the photos to the screen. So that was a key part of this particular activity. And then finally, seeing their work be read by audiences was a key part of this, because it's a chance for them to evaluate how they went, and also to see what others did with the same prompt, which sort of gives them ideas for something for next time. So in terms of curriculum links for this one, down the side there on the right, I've got the key concepts that we were working on. It's the same 4 actually that we had worked on in the other class. So languages, audiences, representations, particularly if you've got one idea and you're representing it in many different ways, and then technologies, not just knowing how to use them, but also how to use them in the best way, being able to employ things like close-ups and wide shots and things like that. And again, on the left, I've linked it to a Akara here, but what was interesting is that these are links to not just the media arts, but also to English. So both of those in this case were quite applicable with their links. And I think that's all I had, Amanda. I think I'm flicking it over to you for a final comment here.
Yeah, thanks, Tammy. So I guess final comment / final plug. Just to say that, if you're a teacher like me, I was always looking for different types of resources to help with media literacy. And so this is something that I created with with a year 2 class. In a project, we were looking at movie making, and using the children's ideas about what makes a good movie and what's important to include in movie making. We've created this comic book. And so it's there for you to freely download if that's something that you might find is useful. Again, designed with young children in mind. It was, like I said, it was a year 2 class. So just a resource that you might find interesting. And I can put the link in the chat as well if the QR code's not working for any reason. And then just to say that we're always open to questions, so there'll be time for some questions now. But if you want to get in touch with us in the future to discuss any of these ideas, our email addresses are there, and we're always happy to talk about media literacy. So get in touch, and we'll throw back to Christine to facilitate the questions and the discussion. Thanks, Christine.
Thank you so much. That's fantastic. I think we've learned so much already. There are a couple of questions, and I have to find where we're up to. Well, someone commented that they loved the name of the activity, which was the Chatterpix one. I saw that one come up. But we're wondering if the children shared their Chatterpix creations with their intended audience. And then if they did, after sharing, did the kids want to make changes to the work that they'd created? And then did they want to create new works? What were sort of the outcomes if they did share the audience with their audience?
Yeah, that's a great question because I didn't mention it. Yes, they did. So those videos were all sent. I mean, they were all home audiences. So the teacher had sent them all home, and it was more just her mentioning it to me afterwards. But she said that she had 4 or 5 parents kind of reach out and say how much they had really enjoyed that and how they'd watched it with the kids. with their children. And I didn't hear about them wanting to make changes once the parents had seen them. I think they were just proud as punch of what they had done, and the parents, I'm sure, were very complimentary about their efforts. But you definitely did see them make changes as they were making it, and particularly as you had a few children standing there with them. I mean, the children were generally pretty happy. That I didn't really hear anyone say, "Oh, that's terrible, you need to do that again," or anything like that. But you would see them tweak things based on that feedback from other children. So, yeah, there definitely was a process of revising their work. And I might just, because I noticed there it said, what responses or interactions to the use of iPads did you have from parents? I'll jump on that one too then. This is an interesting one. In the kindergarten class, because this was research that I was doing, extra permission forms had gone home to parents, just talking about what we were going to do and making sure they were happy. We did have one parent in the kindergarten class who said, no, I don't want my child to have anything to do with any kind of technology. That particular parent, there's several things in the class beyond just my activities that he also doesn't engage in. So it wasn't unexpected for the teacher. But the rest of the parents didn't express any concerns about it. If anything, it was more an activity where this particular teacher herself in the past hadn't really engaged very much with technology. She thought of herself as very much a nature-based person. And so I think this was a good activity for her to sort of, and she really enjoyed the process, but she wanted to see the purpose behind using technology. Why, if I'm using it, there has to be a good reason to use it. And so it was probably more her reactions that I observed and thought were interesting as she came to understand the value of it.
Yeah, I thought they were really interesting because she was quite clearly scaffolding through her use of language with the children what it was that she wanted them to learn. There was a lot of language modeling going on, and you know, my background's actually as a literacy teacher originally, and so I was really interested to see that all of that early childhood literacy was coming through these media literacy activities too. So hopefully people can see the crossover between the different literacies that kids are needing to be able to engage with and become fluent users of these days.
Can I just jump in, Christine, just to just bounce off the question around the sharing, around creating and making new works. So the class that I was in, where we made that, well, we devised that book that I was talking about, it was a year 2 class, and I was there for about 10 weeks, maybe 12 weeks in total. And one of the activities we did really early on was some video game making. It was some really simple video game making using an app on an iPad. But the children, you know, I printed out these little handouts for them to take home. And the children would come back each time I was there and be like, oh, hey, we made a new game using that. So they would make the similar games, the same game using different kinds of objects within their games, or they would iterate it, or they would go and find new ways to make new games. And so, you know, I think that even though we might not necessarily see all of the different creations that are occurring, for some children, this really sparks an interest that is connected to something they already do, or sparks a completely new interest for them. And so I think that even though we might not see it, that doesn't mean that these creations aren't happening sometimes.
I think that's true. And, you know, as the head of education in a museum, that's one of the things that we find, that we don't often see the work that happens after we have those interactions with children. So it's great to hear that. I think you better tell us the name of the app that you use for the game making, because it's already sparked interest in this room.
I'm going to have to look it up.
If you don't know, we'll find out, and we can maybe...
yeah. It was the one that was designed by Octo Studio.
Octo Studio. Perfect.
Yeah.
Now I have one more question, and I know we're running out of time, but it's a really interesting question. We'll see who wants to answer this one. Someone's wondering about whether media institutions can be talked about and taught with young children. So, you know, mostly it's seen as a concept that's engaged with and talked about with quite senior secondary students. So this is a really interesting one to think about.
I mean, I can jump in really super quickly and say that I think it can be just through even making a distinction between a show that's made to entertain as opposed to a show that is meant to inform or something that is meant to persuade. Just introducing those kinds of concepts immediately sort of introduces the idea that there's an intent behind that production, which then points to the idea of institutions. But Tammy or Amanda, you might have other more concrete ideas as well.
Well, I was just thinking, when we're talking about institutions, there's lots of different types, but it also includes media creation institutions such as these days Netflix and Disney, and children are very familiar with those names and those titles. So even just adding a few sentences onto a conversation about that, oh yes, they make a lot of shows for children, don't they? Or talking about on Netflix the kids account versus a parent's account. Or so I was finding that they are talking about institutions, those kind of institutions anyway. So there's an opening there.
I think so, and particularly kids that are playing games,
Yes.
talking about who made the games and why they made them, and their parents are often talking about those things too. Now, I can see that we're running out of time. I don't think there's any more questions. Can't see any in the list there. I'm really grateful to the three of you for talking with us today. So thank you very much for sharing with us, and thanks for joining us today. We'll hopefully see you all next time.